Today we will cover what a headliner is, how to buy them, how to play around them, when to sell them, and what items are great on each headliner. After that, we'll unveil my top 6 tips that I have for playing around headliner units at the very end. So, what is a headliner? In set 10, headliners are the new mechanic. Some may recognize it from the old name of Chosen from set 4, but they're a little bit different. Headliners are automatically upgraded units that come as 2-star champions that show up in your shop. One of their traits is doubled in effectiveness, and they have unique bonuses, often in bonus stats or an augmented ability. They cost the sum of their star levels, so a 3-cost headliner would cost 9 gold, as you're essentially buying 3 units to make a 2-star. So how do you buy these new units, and also, how are they showing up in your shop? Headliners can appear in your shop with each and every shop refresh if you do not already own one. If you do own one already though, they show up every 4th shop. That way it's easy to pivot into different comps without having to sacrifice your entire board. That means if you want to just casually pivot your board slowly over time, you can wait for every 4th shop for a headliner to show up and only sell your existing headliner if you find something that much better. On the flip side, if you want to quickly remix your board, you can sell your headliner and find a new one in every single shop. One thing to note is that you cannot have 2 headliners at the same time, and if you try to buy the headliner in your shop if you already have one, you must sell your existing headliner in order to buy the new one. Headliners show up in your shop based on your level, and there are a couple of handy charts that display how often they show up. For example, in the early levels, you really can only get a 1-cost headliner. But as you get higher and higher level, 2 and 3 costs start getting unlocked, and even 4 and 5 costs later on in the game. One very important thing to note is that on level 7, you have a 0% chance to see a 4-cost headliner, so if that is something you're really looking for, you need to be doing some sort of level 8 strategy, such as a fast 8, which can be found on my leveling guide at bunnymuffins.lol. You'll be able to access this handy chart there also. Next, let's cover how to play around headliners. Using a headliner effectively can significantly strengthen your board, especially in the early to mid game. They are fantastic item holders, and you should try to use one each round if possible, since they provide huge bonuses to your team. Some of y'all might ask, but what if I don't like the headliners I see? Too bad. Try to play them as much as possible. Since headliners are a free 2-star, they give bonus stats and a bonus trait, you are effectively refusing to play an upgraded champion, a trait spatula, which is equivalent to a silver augment in most cases, and you lose out on the bonus stats as well. This is a huge downgrade to your team, and a lot of people don't actually break down what headliners do, so they just think they're missing out on a prime unit. So now that we know that we should try to play one every single round, which headliner should I buy? Obviously, if there was a headliner that gave us the exact traits we wanted, that is going to be perfect. But we are not always so lucky because the world is not perfect. With this in mind, we want to always have a worst case scenario headliner that we want to buy every shop. Again, obviously, if we're going for a pentakill comp, we would take any pentakill headliner that we could find. But what if we can't get that? So let's check out this board here where we have a bruiser pentakill type of board. Obviously, finding a bruiser or pentakill headliner would be great, but what should we do if we don't see that and we can't spend that much gold to look for one? Because often in the early game, as you would have learned from watching the leveling guide, you don't want to roll in a lot of cases. But if we have this exact board of Tahm Kench, Olaf, Gragas, Gnar, and Mordekaiser, what type of headliner units would kind of fit our team? Well, we could look on the side and see that we could add in maybe a double country unit, double disco, or any of the other things that you see on the left side here. That could work too as a temporary measure, because a lot of times you could use a headliner temporarily in order to save some HP. But you could get a little more creative also. You could use something like a 2-star Aphelios in the backline because maybe you need an attack damage item holder. Yeah, Aphelios isn't going to be giving you any good traits, but if he is a rapid fire, he kind of gives the trait to himself anyways. If you plan on going for an attack damage comp later on, obviously he's going to be able to hold those items fantastically for you. What if you're doing an AP build though? Well, you could obviously use something very similar to him, such as a Senna. So with Senna, you could just swap the headliner over to her, take out the Aphelios, and then put some AP items on her, and then transition your team later on into whichever carrier you're going. Maybe you're going for a pentakill Karthus, so you just drop all your items onto Senna, and then once you do get the Karthus, you sell her and then swap the items over and call it a day there. In this specific team comp that we have here, we have a ton of melee units, so adding in a ranged unit that deals a bunch of damage is going to add a ton of value to our team. Obviously, this is only one specific scenario, so don't just go around playing Senna and Aphelios in every team comp just because I said this. I'm trying to give you a method to think critically about your team so that you can kind of see which headliners that show up in your shop can actually be used. Because we don't get many rolls in the game, and the purpose of early game headliners is literally just to save health until we're able to do a big roll down, which normally occurs at either stage 3-2, 3-5, or 4-1. So if you do get one of those early game headliners, when should we sell them? There are two major scenarios for this, and the first one is if you see a better headliner in your every fourth shop headliner. Going back to the build we had before, let's say we have a Bruiser Olaf, what should we do there? Well, maybe we could look up some of the Bruiser units and see that if we get like a Bruiser set, maybe we could just buy that and sell the Olaf and then keep our Bruiser board, because that's an exchange that's really easy to do. Again, we don't have to take many risks because this new set pretty much just showed up in our fourth shop and we got it for free. The other scenario where you want to sell your headliner is if you are about to do a giant roll down of gold. When you do that, you generally expect to buy a new headliner at a higher cost. So if we look at the headliner odds again, if we are going to roll 30 gold at level 6, we might want to find a 2 or 3 cost headliner. Conversely, if we're doing a 4-1 roll down at level 7, again, pretty high chance of getting a 3 cost headliner, so we just sell our Olaf. Later on in the game, if you have a 2 or 3 cost headliner, maybe you want to sell it when you're about to do a 40 gold roll down at level 8, because there's a pretty decent chance to get a 4 cost headliner that's usable in that amount of time. Generally, the reason why we do this is because you do not want to be playing an early game headliner in the late game. The only time you keep a 1 or 2 cost headliner anywhere past stage 4 or 5 is if they are 3-starred. That's pretty much the only reason to do it. So if you're not doing a specific reroll strategy, getting an at least 3 cost but preferably 4 cost headliner is going to be the way to go. Now let's head on into what items are going to be great on each character. So I separated this out into 1 cost, 2 cost, 3 cost, 4 cost, and 5 cost, and also further down into tanks, melee carries, range AD carries, and range AP carries. So I have tanks here on the top left, and you may notice I don't have any items on them. That's because you generally build generic tank items on your tanks, and you're not really looking for specific ones. That's because you generally want specific items on your carries, and the items you want on your tanks change every single game based on whoever you're facing. If you're facing a lot of magic damage, you wouldn't want to build an armor item in a lot of cases, even if they are often built. So you should pretty much always be adapting your tank items, which is why I don't have any items on them right now. I'll go into this further during my itemization guide, but that's a general quick tip that I like to use. Next, we have the melee carries in Olaf and Yasuo, and they share the same items because a lot of melee units, they love the BT Titans combo because it gives a balance of both scaling, defensiveness, and healing, which is something they all need because they're vulnerable in the front. Other good frontline melee carry items is going to be Edge of Night, Crown Guard if they're an ability power unit, pure damage items if they have built-in defensive capabilities, so you could build something like an Infinity Edge, or something like a Quicksilver are generally pretty good. Next we have Evelyn, which is also a melee carry, but she does ability damage, so she likes something like Crown Guard to survive, Archangels to kind of deal damage, and maybe an Ionic Spark because she could put it on a lot of people. I forgot to mention before, but the attack damage equivalent of Crown Guard is going to be the Sterix Gauge, which is definitely an underbuilt item. Next up, we have our backline AP carries on the bottom right in Nami and Annie. Just build generic AP items on them and a mana regeneration item, as you're generally going to use these as item holders for the later parts of the game. For AD carries in Corki and Jinx, the same rules apply, except you just swap the items over to attack damage and attack speed, such as items like Rage Blade, Last Whisper, Infinity Edge, Death Blade, Runons, Giant Slayer, etc. Going into our 2 costs, we have the same thing, generic tank items on the top left, BT Titans combo on the top right, maybe you go full damage on some other ones. And then for the backline, the items we kind of mentioned before. By the way, the items I'm listing here are not items you should be building every single game. I'm just trying to give you some inspiration on what works on some of these champions. With every patch comes new changes, so if you are looking for the exact builds on every single champion, head on over to the website bunnymuffins.lol/meta, where I have an updated list of every comp you should be playing, along with all their itemizations, what augments are good on them, and what units to play, and it's updated every single Friday. If you like to take a more database approach to your items, head on over to teamfight.lol, head on over to stats and champions, and then click on some of the champions you'd like to see what items and traits work best on them. But as you can see, the general pattern still applies. I've just separated out the units into what their category is, either a tank, melee AD, melee AP, backline AP, backline AD for every single cost. You can look at these in your free time on the headliner guide on the website, bunnymuffins.lol. All you have to do is hover over the guide section at the top here and then head on over to headliners. 4 cost is when things get a little bit more interesting though, because a lot of the main carries of a lot of comps are in 4 costs, so I'd probably spend a little bit more time on this page compared to the others. Again, the items I'm listing aren't things that you must build, it's just to give you some inspiration on what type of items are AD items, what are AP items, and what kind of works on a lot of different champions. One thing to note about legendary itemization is that a lot of times you cannot handpick your legendary items because you shouldn't play around legendaries in TFT because they are very difficult to get. A lot of games I'm going for a very specific comp and I would like a specific legendary, but I cannot tell you how many times I do not hit that unit because they are really that rare. Luckily, there are a lot of replacements you could use for them, so you don't automatically lose a game if you don't hit the legendary that you want. Now let's head on over into our tips and tricks for headliners. So one neat little trick that you can do is, since we know that you get a new headliner every 4 shops, even if you already have one, you could play around with pre-leveling a little bit. In case you all didn't know, pre-leveling is when you buy experience so that you will level up on the next round because you get 2 passive experience every single turn. For example, on stage 2-3, you could set yourself so that you're 8 out of 10 XP at level 4 so that when the next round comes after the carousel, you'll gain the 2 bonus passive experience and then become level 5. The reason why you want to do this is because it improves your shop odds for the next round. Coincidentally, if you bought your first headliner on stage 1-4, which is the final round of stage 1, you'll have your 4th headliner shop on stage 2-5, which gives you an increased chance of getting a 2-cost headliner of 70% compared to 20% for level 4. The second tip is to buy normal copies of your low-cost headliner unit just in case you need to sell your headliner later on. That way you could still use the original unit for a trait bonus if you're sticking with that trait. Tip number 3 is that in the early game, you want to be putting as many items on your headliners as possible because you will likely sell them. So even if an item doesn't perfectly match one of your units, you should still stack as many items onto your early game headliners as you can because you'll most likely sell them later on anyways, and you don't have too many items to put on your units in the early game. Obviously, don't take this too out of control because if I have an early game Taric, I'm not about to put an Archangel Staff or a Last Whisper on him. But if I have something like a Bloodthirster for my Taric, why not? Because it still gives him a shield at the end of the day after he reaches a certain health threshold. An example of a backline unit that can kind of use something else, let's say you're going for an attack speed team, but you're playing around with an Annie. If you throw your Rage Blade onto Annie just because you picked Annie just to have a headliner, it's not going to be the end of the world. She's still going to make decent use of the Rage Blade. Tip number 4 is try not to play low-cost headliners in the late game unless they are 3 stars. I've mentioned this before, but it's super important to keep in mind. So a lot of times people keep their headliner because it's a specific trait that they want. Let's say they're going for a KDA build. They're trying to hit 10 KDAs and they have a headliner Evelyn unit. In those cases, obviously, yeah, you want a new KDA headliner, and sometimes you're afraid to take the risk of selling the Evelyn. But you generally should, because either you should be pivoting your comp into something else if you're not hitting any KDAs, or you should at least give yourself a chance to hit something like KDA Akali. You generally should be trying to upgrade your headliners throughout the game, again, based on when you roll. So during stage 1 and 2, having a 1-cost headliner is very nice. Obviously, if you could get a 2-cost headliner at the level 4 shop, that's going to be really powerful, but it's a much lower chance and you probably only get 1 roll of that. However, if you do have a 1-cost headliner, you can upgrade it to a 2-cost one at around level 6 on stage 3-2, but sometimes you could even sneak a 3-cost headliner and skip 2 costs entirely. After that, at level 7, you definitely want to be swapping your 2 costs over to a 3 cost if you are rolling at stage 4-1, but if you are doing a fast 8, that's when you're going to be going for the 4-cost headliners in a lot of games. One thing to note is that when you're rolling down, doing these big roll downs, let's say you have 50 gold, if you ever roll down to like maybe around 20 or 15 gold and you still have not seen your perfect headliner, at that point you kind of have to take whatever is left. So let's say you do a fast 8, it's stage 4-5, you're rolling 60 gold, you're looking for a Kali KDA, but all of a sudden you've rolled and you're down to your last 15 gold. At that point, if you see a headliner Nico or Echo, both units which belong in the comp, you kind of have to settle for them in a lot of cases. Maybe you'll natural your favorite headliner later on in the every fourth shop. Again, it's not ideal, but once you're reaching those very low gold totals, you kind of have to revert back to the early game strategy of taking whatever is there. Tip number 5 is, again, headliners are not permanent. You can always sell them to see something later. So even if you do have to settle on something like a 3-cost Nico, you could always set up a big roll down later on. For example, if you did a fast 8, maybe you roll down on both 4-5 and 5-1. Or you wait until you hit something like level 9, and sometimes you could even get a 5-cost headliner. The last tip, and again, I think this is going to be the most important one for beginners, is that you should always try to play a headliner in every round unless you have a very specific plan or if you are doing a very specific lose streak strategy. Just to reiterate, you are missing out on a 2-star unit, the equivalent of a silver augment, and some bonus stats on that headliner unit if you decide not to play one. So that's, again, a huge sacrifice because that is a ton of resources in TFT. So that's going to be it today for the headliner guide. I hope this illustrated how to play around headliners, what they are, and give you some steps to think about what to do to really master the new set mechanic. All this information will be available on the website bunnymuffins.lol. And of course, if you need a refresher on leveling, which is directly related to headliners, check out this leveling guide over here.